Jill and I would often, with our children when they were younger, travel to Cornwall for a holiday. It was a bit of an epic journey. And so we would often find ourselves stopping off at service stations just to have a moment to stretch our legs, a moment to reflect on how many miles we have done and go, really? That many miles to go? But just a moment to pause on the journey, to find some refreshment and just to have a breather. We arrive at this passage in the story of the Exodus at what I would describe as a bit of a service station moment. Up to chapter 13, you have lots of things going on. There is the call of Moses. Moses goes to Pharaoh. Then there's the plagues. And then there's the moment when Pharaoh says, yes, go. And the people pack up and set off. After chapter 13, there's another phase in the journey that involves the Red Sea and the provision of food to eat and the guidance of God through pillar of cloud and fire. The moment when the 10 Commandments are given, the golden calf moment of rebellion, Moses meeting with the Lord, the Ark of the Covenant given. Chapter 13 feels as if it's a pause in the moment between what has been, what will be. A moment where Moses and the people are given instructions about the importance of reflection, a time to stop. And so it is that in this passage we are told that as people of faith on our journey, we are to do two things. One is that we are to remember what God has done, and the second is that we are to remember what God has promised to do. What God has done and what God promises to do. But there are to be moments on our journey when we are to sit in the service station of faith. Just to take stock. Where have we been and where are we going? So the first thing is that we are encouraged to remember. Moses is instructed, commemorate this day, the day you came out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery, because the Lord brought you out of it with a mighty hand. Around the world, there are many nations who have a day when they celebrate their independence from previous colonial masters. They have a time when they celebrate their liberation. Think about the nation of India. They have their Independence Day when the President of India addresses the nation, highlighting the achievements of the last year. The national anthem is sung, flags are raised and waved. There's a military procession, and across the world, the Indian diaspora celebrate India Day. They have parties, they have festivals, they have celebrations to remember the story of their independence. Remembering. This week, I saw on Facebook a friend of mine sharing a little story. He is a Rangers fan. I know, I'm generous with my friends. And he was off to the European football match this week. And one of the things he said was the fact that when he goes to Ibrox, he often parks where his parents had previously lived. And he makes his way to Ibrox from there. Now, there are quicker ways to get to Ibrox, but he said sometimes it's just good to walk that way and to remember times that I had with my dad. There's something about the importance of remembering what had been, remembering conversations. And so it is that the Lord calls on the Israelites to set aside time to remember. Not just to keep on rushing ahead, but to stop. And he gives two particular rituals which are of significance. And I could probably spend a lot more time on these, but briefly. The first is the Feast of Unleavened Bread. I love food. Love it. And one of the things about food is it, for me, triggers memories. So I will sometimes be out with friends and enjoying a meal, and something that I'm having will take me back to a place where perhaps I had been on holiday. Or it might be that I am having, I'm trying to think of an example here. My gran was a great rice pudding maker. And you're sort of sitting in somebody's house and they've given you rice pudding. And you can't help but in your head, never outside of your mouth, but in your head you're going, yeah, it's just not like my gran's. It's just not the same. Food triggers memory. Taste triggers memory. And so it is that the Israelites are to have this feast of unleavened bread. Because this was a means in which they were to trigger the memory. The memory of what God had done. It was to take them back to the moment when they were still in Egypt, when they were still slaves, and when Pharaoh declared, go. And it was in such a rush that they didn't have time to apply the yeast. And so they picked up their bread, the dough, in their troughs, and they headed off just with what they had. And they were to eat that unleavened bread on the journey to begin with. And so when they had this festival, this feast, they were remembering what God had done, this amazing act. That God, their God, had set them free from Pharaoh. Pharaoh was the big man. He was like a god. Nobody could overpower Pharaoh, and yet the Lord God did. And so they were to remember this moment. And the festival, this feast, was to be held annually in the first month of the year. The first month of the year, before they go ahead, before they do anything, they are to remember where they've come from. That God had liberated them. Once a year, a festival, a time to remember. The second thing that they have to do is connected with the firstborn. The first is always important. Anybody remember their first car? Anybody remember the first house that they lived in after they left their parents' home? Anybody remember their first love? The first is quite significant and important. And so it is that we're told that because what God had done in Egypt and had protected the firstborn of the Israelites, whilst the firstborn of the Egyptians died, there was this sense in which every time the firstborn came, the Israelites were to remember. In the midst of their daily life, when lambs were born, where donkeys were born, when cattle were born, in the midst of their family life, when they had their first child, in these moments, they also were to remember what God had done. That he had saved them and set them free. There we have two rituals that God gives people to remember. We too have some rituals. we have communion. We've not had it for a while, but that may be something that we're working on. But in that moment of communion, as we take bread and as we take wine, we pause to remember that these are symbols of what happened on the cross. This is my body, this is my blood. And so it is that we remember this almighty act of God that brings us freedom. Freedom from sin. Freedom from our past. Freedom from guilt. And we remember that we've been set free because of what Jesus achieved on that cross. Why do we bother coming on a Sunday to worship? You could be doing other things. You could be doing your ironing. Maybe that's a reason why you come, to avoid the ironing. Actually, to what extent is coming for worship one of those rituals? Because every week when we gather together, as we come together, we do so coming to thank God for the week that has been, but also to trust Him for His promises for what is to come. And so even in just gathering here today, we are engaging in this stopping at a service station in our life to pause, to remember what God has done. We will all have stories in our lives about what God has done for us and to us. We will all have stories about the fact that we were praying for someone, praying for ourselves, and God answered. We will all have stories about times when we were maybe struggling to make a decision, and the way in which God seemed to open doors or close doors that allowed us to see the direction that He was leading us in. We all will have stories of how God has been at work because we have a mighty God. And the mighty God that was involved in Exodus is the mighty God who is with us. And so sometimes it's good to just stop and to think back over life, to recall the way that God has been present with us. And I want to encourage you to do that. And I want to encourage you to think about ways in which you can sort of remember those things. I don't know whether I've shared this with you in the past, but a number of years back, Jill and I, with our kids, decided that we were going to have a memory jar, primarily because I've got a rubbish memory. And what the idea was is this jar was in the kitchen, and when we did something, anything, whether it be as an individual or as a family, and we wanted to be able to remember it, we would write it down on a bit of paper, we'd stick it in the jar. And then on Hogmanay that year, we all sat down and we tipped out this jar full of memories. And we dipped in and we opened up and we talked about the things that we were remembering from that year. I wonder if it would be helpful if we had something similar as we think about remembering what God has done for us. The second thing, though, is that this moment of service station reflection, yes, is about looking past, but it's also about looking forward. And so what is it that God says to the people that gives them a sense of hope for that future? He simply says that when you are in the land of Canaan, when you are in the promised land, you are to do these things. So there they are. They're literally just out of their captivity. But God makes a promise. He says, when you are in the promised land, when you are where I am leading you, this is what you have to do. It's almost as if God is saying, yes, I've made a promise, but it's a reality. It's a bit like poppadoms. Anybody here like a poppadom? Yeah, there's a few. The Tabla in Perth, there are other Indian restaurants available. But the Tabla is my go-to. And when I go there, it's often with a couple of friends. And I go in and I sit down. And a few moments later, by magic, the waiter appears. And he presents these poppadoms with chutneys and onions and a whole variety of other things going on. And it's great. But they're not the main course. These poppadoms are just a reminder that there is something better that is yet to come. There is curry with naan and rice. The poppadoms are a guarantee. There's more. And so it is at this moment as God speaks to his people who have just come out, saying, the land will be yours. This is a reality. And that was important because there was a big journey to go ahead. Remember the Red Sea? That was a problem. Imagine that. God says when you're in the promised land, you have to do these things. And the first thing you realize is that you're sitting at a sea and you hear the hooves of the Egyptian army and you think, we're stuck. But the God who is almighty is the God who didn't just liberate them from the past, but set them free for the future. The miracle of the Red Sea. Then we've got the story of the fact that they're a bit hungry. They've used up the unleavened dough to make bread. And they grumble and they complain. And then God provides them with manna to eat throughout the journey of those years. Again and again and again, the God who said in the promised land is the one who continues to deliver for his people. The promises of God for us. God makes so many promises. He speaks about the reality that for those who put their faith in Jesus, they will not die, but they will have life everlasting. We are reminded of the fact that this is not our home, but we are journeying through. And there's this promise that God makes that this reality of eternity with him is there for all of us who trust Christ. But also, he doesn't just promise the end result, he promises to be there on the journey with us, providing, just as he did with the people on the journey in Exodus, providing them with what they need on the journey. So God just doesn't promise something at the end. He promises that he'll be there on the way. So today, I want to encourage us to have some service station moments on our journey of faith. I want us to take time to stop, to remember what God has done, and to remember what God has promised. Someone speaks about the importance of remembering the past and the promises. And he says this: I choose to remember what God has done and what God has promised, because they frame my perspective. Sometimes we're caught in the moment. And sometimes it is by remembering what God has done and what God is going to do that perhaps we're able to see our situation and our circumstances differently. So we are a people on a journey. Let's remember what God has done. And let's remember what God has promised. Amen.